Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices Webcast, and this time we do have slightly advanced scenario because we wanted to talk about the fact that after you started implementing the SharePoint framework in a more detailed way, how do you start promoting code reusability within your enterprise scenarios, or if you are an ISV, how do you build those controls which are then reusable across multiple different client-side web pods. And my name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today, responsible of the demo once again is Waldek Mastercard. So Waldek, will you do the intros as well?
Yes, hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastercard. I work at Rancor, I am a developer, I am also an MVP, and today we will talk about building custom property pane controls with SharePoint framework. Almost got myself there.
Almost got it wrong. All good. So,
well, it only proves that it's complex, right?
Exactly. Like mentioned, this is a relatively complex topic, and this is already an advanced topic, and we kind of use the property pane as the scenario for building these reusable controls. But technically, you can actually build reusable controls for client-side web part presentation layer as well. But property pane is just a nice example how to get started on the implementation. Now, before
I guess when you learn how to do that in the property pane, doing that in body of the web part will only be easier, right? Because you will get from advanced stuff to more medium complexity level.
That's true. That's true. Always good to start with an advanced, really hardcore scenario, and then again simplify that from there. But before we go to the actual slides and the demo itself, just to quickly explain, once again, SharePoint Patterns and Practices is a SharePoint Engineering owned initiative, open source initiative. We provide code samples, reusable components, guidance documentations, community calls, webcasts, a lot of stuff for you to actually take granted. The themes are in SharePoint Framework, SharePoint add-ins for SharePoint Online on-premises, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs in general. AKMS, SharePoint PnP is the one address to remember. But let's actually deep dive on today's topic, or the webcast topic itself. So we're going to talk about custom property pane controls. Like mentioned, these let's say the basic thinking do apply on the presentation controls as well, and we're going to talk about that one after a while as well. But really, when would you implement a custom property pane controls? Well, let's concentrate on a custom property pane controls as a first scenario. And that's really when you have a custom user experience which you cannot achieve using the basic controls which we provide as part of the SharePoint framework. So something like we were just chit-chatting that with Waldek, some kind of a scenarios where you need to pick, for example, you're using mapping control, a Bing or Google map control to select a position in the map or something like that, and you want to implement that one inside of the property pane. Well, pretty advanced scenario, but I think it's a valid use case for that one. These are much more complex to implement than just using the out-of-the-box stuff and using the out-of-the-box controls, which are typically sufficient. So typically you can achieve your business requirements using just the basic controls which are available. But if you can't, then you need to move into the slightly more complex way of doing stuff. When you are actually using these custom controls, you get reusability and isolation of the code. Essentially what we mean with that one is that then you can use these same controls across multiple client-side web parts. And that's really big advantage. So if you are looking into, let's say, you are an ISV, you're building multiple different client-side web parts, many of them have a similar kind of advanced property pane, let's say, configuration scenario, you probably want to have a one piece of code which you maintain, rather than copy-pasting the exact same code to all of the web parts. And that's what the custom controls are actually providing for you. So really the reusability of the code. So how do we actually implement the custom controls? There's a few things to kind of consider. So in the case of property pane, I'll start from the left in the picture area, and then we'll come back on the notes or the bullet points on the slide as well. So in the property pane case, the property pane has certain set of properties which we need to essentially have implemented in our custom control. And those are coming from the iProperty Pane custom control, custom field props, and you need to essentially implement those within your custom control so that your custom control can provide the needed guidance and needed properties and settings for the property pane. And then your custom control is used by the consumer, and consumer in this context means, for example, the developer which is using your custom control within his or her client-side web part to overwrite the property pane. Most likely your custom control has some sort of properties like the default, let's say, address if it's a mapping control, like the default whatever settings or configuration options,
Zoom
how the control
map.
Zoom is a good option. Yes, indeed. So there's kind of a few different interfaces to consider. In the property pane control case, you need to have, like mentioned, the iProperty Pane custom field props implemented, and then you need to have that interface for whatever you are exposing as a configurable option within your control. Anything you want to add there, actually, Waldek, on top of that?
Yes, so actually the things for example that are a part of the iProperty Pane custom field props interface are things like on render. So that property pane that would use the control that you build knows how to render, or actually can render your control. Yes. So that's a thing that you have to expose to property pane, but you don't want to expose on the right hand side. If you look at the chart that we have, that you don't want to the developer who would use the control within the web part, you don't want them to be able to call that, right? Because yes, they might not have the need, or you want to be able to control that by yourself and not have them implement that.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. So that's exactly why, from interface point of view, we split that in two, so that on the one hand side, you have your own properties that you want developers who would use the control that you build to be able to use and set. And on the other hand, you have to expose all of that to the property pane, as well as the prerequisite iProperty Pane custom field props interface with all the things like dispose, render, and all that that's required for your control to work correctly.
True. And obviously we kind of mentioned this one when we started the introduction. So if you would be implementing custom control outside of the property pane to be used as part of the rendering, as an example of your client-side web part, it could be a custom control which is combining, let's say, 3 different Office UI fabric components, but then exposes a simplistic interface to set the properties in, and it renders those 3 components in a certain way. That implementation will look slightly more simplified because you don't have to worry about the interface which is required for the property pane. So, and that's what we meant with during the introduction, what we were saying that we'll start with the complex scenario, and from there we can actually further simplify if you don't use the custom control in the property pane context. Hopefully that did make sense. And kind of if you come from a more, let's say, from a Windows background, the custom controls, what are we actually really truly looking here is that if we go back in the, let's say, Visual Basic 5 timeframe, you might have actually implemented OCX controls. OCX controls were something which you tracked and dropped on your Windows forms, or even even though in this case we talk about control, we really talk about reusability of the code and packaging the code as a reusable piece of functionality. In the classic adding model or CSAM implementation, you probably might have been using the PnP core component. That is reusable code. You don't actually copy-paste the code on every single sample or your implementation. You reuse one piece of code which is versioned independently. And that's really the benefit out of creating these custom controls. You don't version the code as part of the client-side web part. You can version the code independently outside of the web part as well. Good. I think that sums up what are we trying to show. And this will be, when you do know that these webcasts are relatively short, we'll absolutely concentrate on the custom control scenarios more detailed in the future as well. But this is the scenario, what I'll be looking at this case. So we have a custom control on the right side, which is giving us that cascading drop-down experience. To be fair, the user scenario in this particular case wouldn't require a custom control to be implemented, because we're just using a out-of-the-box drop-down experience, or two of the out-of-the-box drop-downs. And we do have a webcast and a sample, which is just implementing this one directly within the client-side web part code. But if you would use that same piece of code in multiple web parts, why would you copy paste the same code multiple times to every single web part? Because that will then cause you a maintenance challenge if you need to modify the code or you need to enhance the code. You would have to go to all of the web parts and copy paste the code there. Rather than implementing that as a one control, you just drag and drop, or well, you don't just drag and drop, you use the control in multiple client-side web part implementations. And probably many of you who are watching the webcast, you hopefully are aware of the Office UI Fabric controls. Those are reusable controls, because they are React controls or components which you can parameterize, and they will then give you the let's say the rendering, the styling, and basic behavior. Good example of the setup. So, or let's say we do have classic ISV providers who are concentrating on implementing reusable components and controls in web development, or in ASP.NET, or in classic forms-based development. There's many ISVs out there who are doing this. You can still do exact same stuff with the SharePoint client side or the SharePoint framework as well. Good. I think we've seen this GIF animation now going through quite a few times, so we understand what's actually happening.
So in other words, I don't think that we have to dive in code, right?
Yes. Fair point. So let's anyway actually move into the demo. So let's have a look on how we would take that existing use case where we have two drop-downs. And like mentioned, that's not necessarily a best use case, but how we would implement that as a reusable component. So you're able to use the same piece of code as a component across multiple client-side web parts. So let's switch to Waldex computer, and let's have a look on the code, which is available for you from a GitHub as well.
All right. So with that, you'll have the chance to see the animated GIF again. So here we are on an empty page in Workbench. We add the web part to the page, and initially we don't do anything, right? So now we want to go and to set the web part up. So we open the property pane, and the first thing that you will see is that we load the list of lists available in this site. So that's exactly what you see here, and there are our lists. Now that we have lists available, and originally you can see that because we didn't pick any list, or there are no items, right? Because we only know items after we selected a list. So at this point, the user can only select a list and cannot select an item. So we select a list, and now we load the items from this list, and now we can pick the item. This scenario looks really a lot like scenario that we discussed another time, where we implemented the same scenario, but then using the building blocks available out of the box.
And one thing related to Waldeck on that one, really kind of emphasizing that situation. So because we have that alternative implementation, and if you're just looking one-time implementation of this functionality, yeah, maybe that's the better way to do that. But if you would have tens of web parts using the exact same scenario, you don't probably want to copy paste the code, and that's why we use that's why you would actually implement a custom control.
Yes, and also there's another thing that differs between the two ways in which we have achieved similarly the same, right? So here, whenever we switch between the lists, we don't block the web part. We only block the controls where we load the data, right? Because we now own the controls, we are able to communicate progress within the pane. We don't need to replace a web part area. Whereas in the past, where we used the building blocks available to us out of the box, we couldn't control property pane. So the only way for us to to tell a user that he needed to wait for us to load the items was to do that in web part. So with that, we had to clear the web part, show spinner there, show the message there, and when the loading was done, repaint the web part. Now we can wrap all of that within the controls that we have built that live in Pane,
yep.
Right? So we don't need to do that in body, right? And now when you pick an item, you will see actually both the list and item in web part. So with that, let's have a look at how is this built in code. So first of all, we go to web part, right? And the web part itself doesn't really do much. Why? Because we built a custom property pane control that wraps all of the code within the code itself, right? So we don't need to expose all of the logic that we have to web part. We contain that within our component, our control class, and we do everything inside there. The only thing that we implement here is the property pane settings when we tell the web part which controls it should use to render properties that we have within the web part. So inside the web part, we have two properties called list and item, and we tell the web part to render both of them using our own property pane async drop-down class. That's the class that we have built, right? And in that class, we can pass the name of the property that to which we want to attach it, as well as some other options such as the label, or for example, the event that triggers whenever drop-down needs to load the options from, right? Because here we use the same control once to load lists and another time to load items. Obviously, the logic to do these two actions is not the same, right? So as the developer who built the control, we expose an event to the developer who would build the web part for them to be able to define how the control should get the items, right? So we do that here. Then we have another event that we expose that triggers whenever user would select an option in the list. So again, developer who builds the web part can react to that. And as you've seen, whenever we select a list, we actually reset the item, we load the items, and we show new items available in a pane. Whereas when we select an item, we only store that in web part. So there are different things that we have to do based on the control. And with the event that we expose here, the developer who actually builds the web part, who would use the control, can do all of that. Another thing that we expose is, for example, property that is selected. So in our case, when you would select a list, you would close the web part, you would reload the page, and you would set it up again. The thing that you would want to see is the list that you have selected in the past, right? You want that to be experience that you have because that's the way the web part works. You select a list, that's being stored within the web part, and even if you would reload the page, you still have exactly the same setup for everyone else to use, right? So you can pass selected value that you store in the web part, in profile, cookie, cache, anything inside the control so that it can show that. And then another thing, for example, that we use within the control that we use to select an item is the state, right? So whether it should be enabled or not. Because in our case, you should only be able to select an item if you selected a list. So with that control or that property, developer who uses the control to build the web part can choose whether the control should be enabled or not. So let's have a look at the property pane async dropdown class, how that is built. So that class represents the custom property pane control that we have built. And to work properly, it has to implement the iPropertyPane field interface that requires a type of properties used by the control to be passed as well. In our case, that's the iPropertyPane async dropdown props interface, which has things like label, load option, on property change, selected key, disabled. And these are exactly the properties that we expose here in the web parts to the developer who would use the control to build the web part to actually set. Right? So anything that you want developers who will use a control to be able to set, you will have to expose. Now, there is one interesting part. This interface requires you to pass the type and will use the type as interface for its properties. But actually for this type, it requires few more things as well. One of the things is if we zoom into that, because for that we have implemented another interface, and you will see why. So here we extend the, or actually we combine the iPropertyPane async dropdown props interface that we have built ourselves with the out-of-the-box iPropertyPane custom field props interface, which has things like onRender, onDispose, and context. And if you go all the way back to the class here, which is here, the property pane, in order to be able to render our control, has to have the render event, right? So that comes from the out-of-the-box iPropertyPane custom field props interface that we implement. But we do, but we don't want to expose the onRender event or the method to the developer who would use the web part or use the control within the web part, right? Because imagine that if we implemented exactly the same interface here, if you would go back to web part, suddenly here you would have to implement the onRender, right? And you would have to, or you would basically override the way we render the control. So we don't want to do that. So with that, we actually hide the internal prerequisites that framework requires from the controls that you build from the developer who would actually only use the control within the web part. So that's exactly why here we have iPropertyPane async dropdown props, which are all the things that you want developers who would use the web part to be able to set, versus the things that the web part or that the control has to have in order for it to work correctly, which is here, which is actually a combination of everything that you want developers to be able to set with everything else that's required by the framework. So the things like render, dispose, and context. At that point, basically what we do is that we trigger events, we build that in React. So we create a React component that does the rendering, right? So here we have React code that has its own state properties, and in that way it works very similar at this point. It works similar to how you would build a web part in React, right? It's exactly the same. You work with state, you pass properties, and it gives it back. And at that point, we can trigger events. We pass all of it back, right? All the way up to web part. Interesting part is as well, right? So here we have events like load list, on list change, and we implement these events in web part. Right, because the control itself doesn't really have the logic to load lists, because the control that we have built, the only thing that it can do is it loads data that it has from a synchronous source, right? Or actually in an asynchronous way. But what the source is and all of that, the control itself does not do it. So, or the control itself does not know it. The only thing that it does is that it exposes event that the developer who will use the control to build the web part can use, like we do here, for example, load the lists, right, or load items.
And this way you have a kind of a separation of concerns as well. So the web part is the one which is responsible of loading the stuff, but then the control is the one which is responsible of the behavioral between the different data what has been loaded. Technically, you could actually load the stuff obviously in the control as well, but then that would reduce the reusability of the control. It's a matter of it's an architectural decision. Where do we want to do that?
Yes, and actually it would take it all away, right? Because if you would build a control that loads items from a list, then you would need to have another one that would load the things from, or that would load the list from the web. You would have to have another one to load items from the list.
Yes.
So that way, we can actually have that reusable control that we can use for anything, to load lists, to load items, people, images, terms, to use for search, anything that we want, because the logic to load the data is stored outside of the control. And it's worked exactly the same as if you would use imagine you would use a button, right? The button itself offers you ability to perform a click. But what you do on a click, you define yourself. That's not defined in control.
Absolutely. Right? Well, there is multiple kind of that's no doubt the right way of doing stuff. So technically, you could do that. It's not feasible to do. And maybe there's certain scenarios where you want to build this more, let's say, dedicated controls, which are then used by client-side web parts. Who knows? Both options are valid. But no doubt, this way, the control itself concentrates on the UX. It doesn't concentrate on where the data is actually coming. So really good approach.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that I hope that gives everyone a good overview of how it works, how it's built, how you can react to events. And with that, I think it's good to go back to the slides.
Sounds good. Let's switch back on the presentation and close up the webcast. Thank you, Waldek. Good. Good demo. Hopefully you were able to understand the value of that one. It is slightly complex, like we've been mentioning through the webcast quite a few times. And this is an advanced scenario. If you're looking into just, hey, I want to implement my first client-side web part using SharePoint framework, well, maybe this isn't actually for you. But then after a while, when you've implemented, let's say, few web parts, 10 web parts, you start rethinking, okay, how can I be more efficient with my coding? And that's when you start thinking reusability of the code. And that's when you start probably thinking also the reusable controls. And then that's where these scenarios are valid for you. So we absolutely recommend to download the sample, have a look on it, and try to kind of adapt the models. And we're looking into, no doubt, adding and providing additional guidance in the guidance documentation around the reusable control creation as well. Now, Waldek, anything from your side as closing notes?
You mean anything else?
Yes.
No. You've said everything that I wanted to say. So with that, thank you everybody for watching, and we will come up with a webcast sooner or later.
Thank you.